Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are 1 Chronicles chapter 1, first chapter of this book, and Luke chapter 12. Now, 1 Chronicles is a history book like Samuel and Kings that goes through the timeline, particularly of the kings of Israel, and it's pretty much structured like this. The first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles look at the genealogy from Adam through to post-Babylonian exile. Then from chapter 10 in 1 Chronicles 1 through to about midway through, about chapter 9 of 2 Chronicles, we deal with David and Solomon and their reigns, the prime kings of Israel. And then from chapter 10 of 2 Chronicles through to the end, that's around about chapter 36, we deal with the divided kingdom, but concentrating mainly on the southern kingdom, that of Judah, the remnant, the ones that are carrying the promises of God. So King David, King Solomon, King Hezekiah. Now, the difference between 1 Chronicles and Kings and Samuel is that it's not just a history book, but there's an interpretation of why things took place. And generally the writer, the chronicler, is giving the reason as covenant. He describes the covenant people, the remnant. He describes the place where the covenant is at work, the temple. And then he describes the reason behind the covenant, so the redemptive purposes of God. Now, it was written around about the times of Ezra and Nehemiah when the children of Israel were scattered all over the place. So that's why it's so important. The genealogy is so important. Some people have said, an elder friend of mine the other day said, I'm going through various books of the Bible and I'm reading them systematically. And so I started on 1 Chronicles, but after the 3rd chapter, I just gave up. It was just name after name after name. Why is that so important? Well, just think about it. The people of Israel are scattered. They're in exile. And the chronicler is saying, from Adam through to today, God still has his hand on the people. They might be scattered, but he still has his hand. In fact, he raised up the Babylonians. He raised up the Hittites and the Philistines, etc., etc. And they are all chronicled. Their origins are chronicled in the chronicles of the first 9 chapters of the book of 1 Chronicles. And basically, when God's putting these names to people, and he says, look, this guy was a son of a concubine, and this one became a king, and this one became a mighty warrior, he's basically saying, God's not finished with us yet. Now, you might be in a similar position to that, thinking, God, have I blown it? He's saying, he's not finished with you yet. That's the message of 1 Chronicles 1. We'll pick up the reading tomorrow. But let's go to Luke in chapter 12. Now, Jesus does, Luke chapter 12, by dealing with the Pharisees. And he says this. He says that there is nothing of your hypocrisy that won't be revealed in the future. He's basically saying all's going to be revealed. He's calling them out, preaching one thing, living another. There was this famous author, Sir Arthur Doyle. You might remember him. He wrote Sherlock Holmes, but he was a bit of a practical joker. And he was, friends with people in high society England. And so what he did is he sent a practical joke to 12 of his friends. He says, all will be revealed, flee. And to his horror, within 24 hours of the letters arriving at his friends' houses, there was not one left in England. Now, those details might be a little bit exaggerated, but the point is the same as what's going on here. Jesus is calling out the Pharisees saying, there's nothing that you're doing in darkness, that you're doing hidden away, that's not eventually going to be revealed. And then he says this. Most of this chapter is about his second coming, saying he's going to return. He's going to return like a thief in the night when you least expect him. And so his encouragement to us in this chapter is like this. 1, do what you're called to do. Let the thief when he comes back, or the bridegroom when he comes back, find you doing, the master when he comes back, he uses these metaphors, find you doing what he called you to do. Secondly, don't be encumbered by all sorts of worldly things. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, is what he's saying. And then a big part of the chapter, he focuses on your provision, on worry, what you're pursuing. And he's basically saying, look, the flowers of the fields. I'm up here on a hill behind Cape Town. Beautiful flowers. It's flower season. There are birds out here. In fact, Jesus uses both these illustrations. He says the birds, God looks after them. The flowers, he clothes them. Look how beautifully he clothes them. Guys like me who've lost hair, every single hair that floated to the ground, he said, I knew when it was falling to the ground. He says, look, God looks after nature. He's mindful of every single detail that happens to you. Don't stress about these things. Focus on the kingdom and ask him, and he'll provide for you. And he says this in verse 32, probably my most favorite verse in this chapter. Do not be afraid, little flock. Your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. I love those words. The Father is pleased to give you, little flock, his kingdom. I can remember giving my children gifts that cost me a lot. I remember giving a very expensive cricket bat to my son and seeing the delight on his face, or a little bicycle to my daughter and seeing the glee on her face. It was a delight for me to give those things. And this is what he's saying. He's saying it's a delight for God to look after you. Just as he delights in providing the world with nature, he delights in looking after you. Don't fret. Get your eyes on things eternal. He's returning. Let him find you ready. Let him find you busy. Let him find you waiting for him.